Do you remember those things from the 1970s? The ones so common then but now completely obsolete? In the 1970s, these everyday objects shaped family life, from how we worked to how we played. But how did such familiar parts of daily living vanish so completely? TV remote on a wire sounds almost like a joke today, but in the 1970s it was one of the first steps toward home convenience. Instead of pointing a plastic remote across the room like we do now, some televisions came with remotes that were literally tethered by a cord. It was often stretched across the living room floor, ready to trip anyone who walked by. These remotes usually only controlled power and volume, but in the 1970s that was revolutionary. Families who had them felt like they were living in the future, even if the setup was clunky and restrictive. Kids sometimes tugged the cord too hard, yanking the television forward and earning glares from parents. What made it so memorable was not just the novelty, but the contrast. Most people were still twisting knobs and clunking dials, while a lucky few were sitting back with push-button control. Today, the idea of a wired remote seems laughable, but back then it was a status symbol, even if it meant your living room looked like it was covered in extension cords. S&H Green stamps were once a national obsession, and you will not find them anywhere today. Grocery stores, gas stations, and department stores handed them out with purchases, and families carefully pasted them into little booklets. Once you had enough filled books, you could redeem them for rewards from a thick catalog, anything from toasters to bicycles. It was like a slow-motion loyalty program that got everyone involved, especially children who loved helping lick and stick the stamps. Many households had drawers full of unfinished books, each one representing weeks of saving. For families on tight budgets, green stamps meant the chance to get something special without spending extra. Catalogs were treated like treasure maps, circled with wish lists and arguments about which item to claim. The system faded in the 1980s, but in the 1970s, it was a cultural ritual that turned grocery shopping into a game of patience and reward. Console stereos were not just music players, they were furniture, status, and centerpiece all rolled into one. These massive wooden cabinets combined radios, record players, and later even 8-track decks inside a single polished piece of living room decor. Families placed lamps, photos, or vases on top, treating them as much like sideboards as electronics. The sound filled the room, and the design gave homes an instant sense of sophistication. Kids sprawled on shag carpet, listening to records spinning inside, while adults used them for parties or quiet evenings. Opening the lid to change an album felt ceremonial, like lifting the hood on a prized car. These stereos were built to last, with solid wood and heavy components, but their size made them impractical once technology shrank. Today, they look more like antiques than electronics, but in the 1970s, they were the heart of countless households. Encyclopedia salesmen knocking on your door were a common sight in the 1970s, and their product was considered essential for any serious household. They carried samples of glossy volumes from Britannica or World Book, impressing parents with the promise of giving children a head start in school. Entire sets could cost hundreds of dollars, but families often signed up for installment plans, paying little by little until the shelves were full. For kids, the arrival of a new encyclopedia felt like a landmark, rows of knowledge bound in leather and gilt. Before the internet, these books were the gateway to answers, projects, and late-night homework sessions. Salesmen leaned heavily on that responsibility, reminding parents that education was worth every penny. By the end of the decade, encyclopedia sets became symbols of middle-class pride, even if they were rarely opened after the initial excitement. Today, the idea of buying knowledge door-to-door feels almost absurd, but in the 1970s, it was a household investment that defined an era. Revolving TV knobs were a part of daily life before remote controls became common. Changing the channel meant walking across the room and clunking a dial into place, often with a satisfying click that echoed through the living room. Choices were limited, maybe 5 or 6 channels in most areas, and the knob sometimes broke after too much twisting. Parents often wrapped tape around loose knobs or kept pliers nearby to grip the broken stem when the plastic finally gave out. Kids became experts at fine-tuning the picture, holding the knob just right while balancing the antenna for the clearest signal. For many families, the ritual of turning that dial became part of the evening routine, as familiar as the shows themselves. Kids became unofficial remotes, told by parents to get up and change it. The process felt mechanical, almost like shifting gears in a car. Static bursts and blurry reception were normal, requiring delicate knob adjustments and sometimes a slap on the side of the set. Despite the hassle, there was a certain charm in that clunky sound, a reminder that technology was still tactile and imperfect. Today, the memory of revolving knobs instantly transports people back to wood-paneled living rooms and family evenings gathered around the glow of the television. Metal ice cube trays with levers were one of the strangest kitchen contraptions of the 1970s. Before plastic trays and automatic makers, you filled these heavy aluminum trays with water and slid them into the freezer. Once frozen, you yanked a metal lever that cracked the ice loose, but often pinched your fingers in the process. Sometimes the cubes stuck so stubbornly that the whole tray had to be run under hot water, wasting half the ice in the process. Families joked that it took more effort to get the cubes out than to make a drink in the first place. Guests could always tell when someone used the lever, because the clanging sound echoed across the kitchen. The sound of that lever snapping free is unforgettable, a metallic clank followed by cubes scattering everywhere. Families used them constantly for drinks, cocktails, and pitchers of Kool-Aid. Kids dreaded refilling them, since the trays were heavy and awkward, but empty ones never lasted long. They were reliable but far from user-friendly, and when plastic trays arrived, no one looked back. Still, the memory of those finger-pinching levers remains a shared experience for anyone who grew up before the age of automatic ice. Key parties are infamous as one of the strangest social fads of the 1970s. The idea was simple but shocking. Couples would toss their car keys into a bowl at a party, and at the end of the night, partners would draw keys at random to decide who went home with whom. It was a reflection of the decade's experimentation, free love, and rebellion against traditional norms. The truth is, most suburban couples only heard about key parties from magazines or late-night talk shows, but the idea spread like wildfire. Rumors exaggerated how common they were, making them sound like neighborhood rituals when in reality they were rare curiosities. Still, the phrase "key party" became shorthand for the era's adventurous side, whether anyone actually participated or not. Though not nearly as common as rumors suggested, the concept took on a life of its own in pop culture. Jokes, films, and whispered gossip turned it into a defining symbol of the swinger lifestyle. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was scandal. Either way, the fad has vanished, leaving behind nothing but myth and legend. Today, key parties stand out as one of the most bizarre and obsolete markers of 1970s adult culture. Woolworth's five and dime stores were woven into everyday life, especially in small towns. You could buy almost anything: school supplies, toys, fabric, or a quick lunch at the counter. Families made regular trips, and kids loved wandering the aisles filled with treasures that cost just a few cents. The soda fountains and lunch counters inside became community hubs, where people gathered for pie, coffee, or hamburgers. Parents remember sending children with just a few coins, knowing they could return with candy, marbles, or even small gifts. The counters were gathering places where teenagers worked their first jobs and retirees met for coffee. Walking into a Woolworth's felt less like shopping and more like stepping into the heart of town life. For decades, Woolworth's was the definition of affordable shopping. By the 1970s, they were still going strong, but discount giants and malls soon pushed them out. By the 1980s and 1990s, Woolworth's closed for good in the United States, leaving behind fond memories of nickel candies and counter lunches. Checkerboard lunch trays in schools were iconic in the 1970s. Made of heavy fiberglass, they were divided into sections for the main dish, sides, dessert, and milk carton. Students carried them through the cafeteria line, often banging them against each other as they shuffled along. The trays were sturdy but heavy and sometimes chipped at the corners after years of use. Some schools etched numbers into them for inventory, so students often ended up with battered trays marked with years of wear. Kids joked about which tray was lucky and which one carried permanent stains no amount of scrubbing could remove. The clatter of hundreds of trays hitting tables at once is a sound many people can still hear in memory. They were washed and reused endlessly, making them a fixture of school cafeterias across the country. Children remember the clatter, the smell of mystery meat, and the sight of those trays sliding across rails toward a waiting lunch lady. Eventually, disposable trays replaced them, lighter and cheaper for schools to manage. Today, the checkerboard lunch tray lives only in memory, a symbol of 1970s cafeteria life. Drive-in bank tubes were futuristic marvels in the 1970s. Customers would pull up, put their deposit slip or cash into a clear cylinder, and watch it get whisked away through a vacuum tube to the teller inside. Seconds later, the cylinder shot back with a receipt or change. Kids riding along found it magical, like something out of science fiction. Some children swore the tube could launch into outer space, while adults treated it as a glimpse of the future. On busy Saturdays, families sat in cars watching lines of cylinders shoot back and forth, turning banking into a small spectacle. For many, the whoosh of the tube was as thrilling as the errand itself. Adults appreciated the convenience of banking without leaving the car, especially in bad weather. The whoosh of the tube became part of the ritual, a sound tied to progress and efficiency. While some banks still use them, they are far less common in today's world of mobile apps and ATMs. Back then, however, those tubes felt like stepping into the future every time you made a deposit. Paper dress fashion was one of the strangest blips of the 1970s. The idea seemed futuristic at the time. Cheap, colorful dresses made entirely from disposable paper, meant to be worn once and then thrown away. Companies marketed them as chic, convenient, and perfect for women who wanted variety without the cost of multiple outfits. At first, the novelty caught on, with bright patterns and bold prints that looked perfectly at home in the psychedelic landscape of the decade. Some even advertised dresses with logos or pop art designs, turning the wearer into a walking billboard. But paper was, after all, paper. It tore easily, was highly flammable, and felt uncomfortable against the skin. Women quickly realized the fad was impractical, especially when a spilled drink or gust of wind could ruin an entire outfit. The idea of literally throwing away fashion might sound absurd now, but in the 1970s, it was briefly hailed as modern and liberating. By the end of the decade, the paper dress was relegated to novelty status, a curious relic of a time when even fashion was experimenting with disposability. TV dinners with aluminum foil lids were a staple of 1970s kitchens. Long before microwave-safe plastic trays, families cooked frozen meals directly in their ovens, peeling back shiny lids to reveal steaming compartments of meatloaf, peas, or Salisbury steak. These dinners were marketed as futuristic convenience. No planning, no prep, just pop them in and wait. Kids would argue over who got the brownie that came in its own tiny slot, often burnt at the edges but gooey in the middle. Parents relied on them after long workdays, grateful for a meal that required no pots, pans, or cleanup. Advertisements even made them look glamorous, as though frozen peas and instant mashed potatoes were part of a modern, space-age lifestyle. Children loved the novelty of each item in its own little section, while parents enjoyed the ease of a hot meal without the time commitment. The foil trays gave the food a distinctive taste and texture, with edges often crisping or burning while the center stayed lukewarm. Still, in an era when working families needed shortcuts, they were revolutionary. The frozen food aisle became a battleground for companies competing to offer the most appealing combinations, and entire brands built their names on these oven-ready meals. Today's microwavable trays have taken their place, but the memory of those foil-topped dinners remains tied to 1970s households and the promise of modern living. Roller rinks with carpeted walls were a sensory overload of the 1970s. Neon carpets covered not just the floors but the walls, often with loud patterns of stars, swirls, or checkerboards that glowed under blacklight. The walls were padded and carpeted to soften falls, but they quickly became iconic backdrops for teenage hangouts. Roller rinks were more than just places to skate. They were community hubs where kids gathered to listen to disco tracks, flirt, and show off their best spins under the mirror ball. Many first crushes, first kisses, and even first heartbreaks happened on those rinks, with the glowing walls as silent witnesses. Snack bars sold greasy pizza and fountain sodas, fueling kids who skated until their ankles ached. The mix of music, sweat, sugar, and neon made roller rinks feel like miniature nightclubs for teens who were too young to get into the real thing. The clatter of wheels on hardwood mixed with the thump of speakers blasting funk or rock. Carpeted walls absorbed the noise, but they also trapped the smell of sweat and concession stand popcorn. Parents dropped off their children with a few dollars, knowing they would spend hours skating in circles, munching on candy, and plotting dances with friends. By the 1980s, many of these rinks were redesigned or closed, and the carpeted walls disappeared. But for those who grew up then, the sight of neon carpet remains burned into memory as part of a uniquely 1970s skating culture. Doctors handing out candy-flavored medicine samples seems almost unbelievable now, but it was routine in the 1970s. Pediatricians often gave children small packets or bottles of chewable, sweet-tasting samples to try at home. Kids loved them, often mistaking the samples for treats, while parents trusted the doctor's judgment. It was part of a larger culture where pharmaceuticals were marketed casually, without the strict safety and labeling standards of today. Children would sometimes line up eagerly in waiting rooms, hoping for a treat after their checkup. Parents were reassured by colorful packaging and friendly names, even if the safety information was limited or confusing. What seemed playful and harmless back then would make modern parents shudder, as awareness of dosage and child-proofing barely existed. Bubblegum-flavored antibiotics and fruit-flavored aspirin were common giveaways, intended to encourage compliance. But the risks were obvious. Children sometimes confused the samples with candy, and overdoses were not unheard of. Eventually, regulations tightened and the practice disappeared. Today, the idea of doctors passing out candy-like pills directly to kids would be unthinkable, but in the 1970s, it was just another example of how differently safety was viewed. Gas rationing cards became symbols of frustration during the 1970s energy crisis. Families were issued cards that dictated which days they could fill up their cars, based on license plate numbers or rationing schedules. Long lines snaked out of gas stations with drivers anxiously clutching their cards, hoping supplies would not run out before their turn. The cards became part of daily life, kept in glove compartments alongside registration papers. Fights sometimes broke out in lines, with tempers flaring as people waited hours for just a few gallons. Children remember sitting in the back seat, watching their parents stress over whether the tank would last until their next eligible day. Neighbors shared rides, and odd and even days became common phrases in everyday conversations. People organized carpools, cut back on trips, and even bought smaller cars to stretch their fuel. Gas stations posted "No gas today" signs, leaving entire neighborhoods stranded. For many Americans, it was the first time they felt the fragility of the modern lifestyle they had come to rely on. Today, the cards are forgotten relics, but at the time, they represented a national moment of scarcity and adaptation. Pay toilets in public restrooms were another fixture of the 1970s that has all but vanished. Airports, bus stations, and even shopping centers often required coins to unlock stalls. For travelers and city dwellers, carrying spare change was as essential as carrying a wallet. Children sometimes found themselves stranded, desperately needing a stall but without a dime to their name. Travelers swapped horror stories of missed connections or embarrassing waits while searching for coins. Even comedians of the day poked fun at the absurdity of needing pocket change just to answer nature's call. The practice was controversial, especially for women, since stalls cost money while urinals were often free. Activists argued that it unfairly burdened those who could least afford it, and campaigns to ban the pay toilet system gained momentum throughout the decade. By the late 1970s, most states had eliminated the practice, and pay toilets became a punchline rather than a reality. Today, the thought of paying to use a public restroom feels alien. But in the 1970s, it was a frustratingly common part of travel. Typing class with correction tape was a rite of passage for many high school students in the 1970s. Rows of clunky typewriters filled classrooms, the clatter of keys creating a rhythm of learning. Students drilled on accuracy and speed, but mistakes were inevitable. Correction tape became the savior, little white strips cranked into the typewriter that covered up errors before striking the key again. The process required finesse. Press too hard and you tore the paper. Too light and the mistakes still peeked through. Students often left visible ghosts of old letters, reminders of their struggles with precision. For many, the smell of ink ribbons and the whir of the carriage return are forever linked to the stress of timed typing drills. The process was messy and imperfect, often leaving visible marks, but it taught precision and patience. Teachers stressed that typing was an essential skill for the workplace, especially as secretarial jobs and office work boomed. By the end of the decade, typewriters with self-correcting features began to appear, but most students still remember the tactile ritual of rolling in the tape, striking the correction key, and hoping the page still looked neat. Today, it feels ancient compared to word processors and autocorrect, but in the 1970s, it was cutting-edge education. Waterbeds in every bedroom were perhaps the most famous fad of the 1970s. Introduced as luxurious, modern, and even sensual, they quickly spread from college dorms to suburban homes. The feeling of floating on a sloshing mattress was unlike anything else, and advertisements claimed waterbeds were good for your back and for relaxation. Entire stores were devoted to selling them, offering models with heaters, padded frames, and even mirrored headboards. But leaks were legendary, soaking carpets and warping floors in the middle of the night. Moving one required draining gallons of water, wrangling a heavy bladder, and reinstalling it like a home project. Families who owned them often laughed later about how impractical they really were, even if they loved them at the time. But the reality was less glamorous. Waterbeds leaked, burst, and were nearly impossible to move. Parents found them impractical, while teenagers loved their reputation as cool and slightly rebellious. By the 1980s, maintenance headaches outweighed the novelty, and most households gave them up. Today, waterbeds are remembered as quirky symbols of 1970s excess, loved and loathed in equal measure. Film cameras with flash cubes were another everyday item now completely obsolete. Each cube held 4 tiny bulbs, rotating after every picture to provide bright, disposable flashes. Families carried extra cubes in pockets or purses, ready to capture birthdays, vacations, and school events. The cubes gave off a distinctive hot smell and sometimes burned fingertips if touched too quickly after firing. Parents winced at the cost of buying and replacing cubes, especially when half of them failed to fire. Kids loved watching the bulbs blacken after use, turning them in their hands like little trophies. That combination of excitement and expense made every click of the shutter feel significant, unlike today's endless digital snaps. They were magical in their way, but also inconvenient, since they had to be constantly replaced. Photos were limited, expensive to develop, and unpredictable, with whole rolls ruined by bad lighting or shaky hands. Still, those little cubes are etched into memory as part of the ritual of picture-taking in the 1970s. Today, with endless phone storage and instant digital previews, flash cubes seem almost laughable, but at the time they were state-of-the-art technology. Checker cab taxis were once iconic symbols of American cities, especially in the 1970s. Painted bright yellow with bold black checkerboard stripes, they became part of the urban landscape in places like New York and Chicago. Their boxy design made them roomy for passengers and instantly recognizable on crowded streets. Checker cabs were featured in films, TV shows, and advertisements, reinforcing their status as cultural icons. The smell of vinyl seats, the clang of the heavy doors, and the chatter of drivers created an experience unique to the era. Many drivers were local characters with reputations for storytelling or gruff efficiency, adding to the city's character. For visitors, riding in a checker was almost as important as seeing the skyline itself. Drivers were known for their no-nonsense style, weaving through traffic with efficiency and sometimes a little too much bravado. For many city dwellers, hailing a checker cab was part of daily life, whether heading to work, home, or a night out. By the 1980s, stricter regulations and competition from newer fleets pushed them out of service. Today, a restored checker cab is more likely to be seen in a car show than on a busy street, but their legacy as the taxi of the 1970s remains strong in collective memory. Polaroid Swinger cameras were one of the most aggressively marketed gadgets of the 1970s, and they are now remembered as both a cultural artifact and a stepping stone in photography. Marketed primarily toward teens and young adults, the Swinger was sold as a budget instant camera designed to make picture-taking simple, affordable, and fun. Its white plastic body and bold lettering gave it a futuristic look for the time, while advertisements hammered home the slogan, "Meet the Swinger." Unlike pricier Polaroids, it used roll film and produced small black and white prints that developed in your hand within minutes. For teenagers at the time, it was magical. Snap a shot at a party, wave it around, and pass it to friends before the night was over. The Swinger was especially appealing because it was inexpensive compared to other Polaroid models, giving young people a way to enter the world of instant photography without needing their parents' wallets. It was clunky, sure, and the photos often came out blurry or poorly lit, but that hardly mattered when the novelty was the point. Today, the Swinger looks like a toy next to sleek smartphones, but in its day, it was considered modern and liberating. It belongs firmly in the pile of 1970s innovations that felt cutting edge but quickly became obsolete once technology leapt ahead. CB radios in family cars were another peculiar hallmark of the 1970s. Citizens Band radio exploded during the decade, partly because of the energy crisis and partly because trucker culture seeped into mainstream America. Families installed CBS in their station wagons, not because they needed to communicate across highways, but because it felt cool and futuristic. Kids in the back seat loved listening to the chatter of truckers, picking up lingo like Breaker 19 and Good Buddy. Parents occasionally chimed in too, usually in awkward voices, trying to join the fun. The fad made driving more entertaining, turning road trips into live broadcasts of banter and code words. For a short time, having a CB gave families the sense that they were part of a secret club on the highways. Of course, once cell phones and better car entertainment arrived, CB radios lost their relevance almost overnight. Today, they are remembered as quirky symbols of an era when staying connected meant flipping dials, not scrolling screens. Kiddie pools made of metal were a summertime staple of the 1970s and also one of the most impractical inventions of the decade. Unlike today's inflatable plastic versions, these were shallow basins of steel or aluminum, often with sharp edges and a tendency to rust. Parents would drag them out into the yard, fill them with a hose, and watch as children splashed happily, at least until someone scraped a knee on the side. On sunny days, the metal got scorching hot, leaving kids yelping as they climbed in or out. They dented easily, leaked constantly, and became mosquito breeding grounds if left full for too long. But for families without access to public pools, they were cheap and accessible ways to beat the heat. Many children who grew up in the 1970s remember those metal pools with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief, wondering how anyone thought they were safe. By the 1980s, plastic completely replaced them, and no one looked back. They remain a strange relic of a time when convenience mattered more than comfort or common sense. Homemade slide shows in basements were another unmistakable ritual of 1970s family life. Before digital albums and cloud storage, families developed rolls of film into slides, carefully placed them into carousels, and projected them onto a wall or pull-down screen. Guests were invited over for the big show, often after vacations or holidays, where they sat in folding chairs while Dad narrated every single image. The smell of warm projector bulbs, the whir of the fan, and the inevitable slide jams became part of the experience. For kids, it was pure torture, sitting through hours of out-of-focus sunsets or endless shots of mountains. Adults pretended to be polite, nodding along, even as their eyes glazed over. Despite the boredom, slide shows were family bonding at its most earnest, an attempt to share moments in a world without instant social media. By the 1980s, camcorders and videotapes began to replace them, and eventually, digital photography erased the need entirely. Today, slide projectors gather dust in thrift shops, their glory days long gone. But anyone who sat cross-legged on a shag carpet watching vacation pictures knows the peculiar mix of pride and tedium that defined these evenings. Cigarette machines in restaurants were once as common as jukeboxes, and they perfectly capture how different public attitudes toward smoking were in the 1970s. Tall, shiny machines stood near the entrances of diners, bowling alleys, and even family-friendly eateries. For a handful of coins, anyone could pull a lever and receive a neatly packed carton of cigarettes, no questions asked. There were no ID checks, and plenty of teenagers used the machines to buy their first packs. Parents often walked by without a second thought, since smoking was still seen as normal and even sophisticated. Advertisements were plastered across the machines, glowing with brand logos that made them hard to miss. The sound of coins clinking down and the thud of a pack dropping into the tray became part of the restaurant atmosphere. As smoking bans spread and regulations tightened, the machines disappeared almost overnight, leaving behind only faint memories. Today, the idea of buying cigarettes next to a burger and fries feels shocking, but in the 1970s, it was just part of the scenery. Macrame was the art of patience, the quiet repetition of hands knotting rope into something beautiful. Wall hangings, plant holders, table runners. It was more than a craft, it was a statement. In an age of fast food and faster living, macrame asked you to slow down, to sit, to tie, to create, and suddenly, thread became texture. Homes across the country were draped in soft, swinging loops of rope that felt like something organic, something alive. It made a room feel warmer, more human. You could not rush it. That was the point. Each piece took hours, sometimes days, to finish. There were no shortcuts. And in that commitment, people found meaning. Macrame circles popped up in basements, backyards, and community centers. Friends would gather, coffee steaming, rope twisting between their fingers as they talked about everything and nothing. You did not need to be an artist. Just willing, just present. The results were imperfect and earthy, like little monuments to stillness. And even when the trend faded and the rope yellowed with time, those pieces never lost their charm. They stayed. They reminded us of the power of slowness in a world that kept speeding up. It was small, square, and maddening. The Rubik's Cube took over the 1980s like a brainy little virus, impossible to solve, harder to put down. Originally invented in Hungary in the 1970s, it exploded into the United States like intellectual wildfire. Every school desk had one, every locker, every coffee table, and everyone thought they could beat it until they tried. It was not just a toy, it was a statement, a challenge, a social flex. Can you solve it? Was the question of the year. And if you could, you were royalty. Kids timed themselves, adults pretended not to be frustrated, and puzzle competitions became legitimate televised events. There was something deeper going on too. It was the Cold War, the space race, the computer age, and the Rubik's Cube fit right in. Order from chaos, logic over emotion. It felt futuristic, clean, brilliant. Then, slowly, it vanished from center stage. Too hard, too humbling, too analog. But those colorful little squares still sit in drawers, waiting to remind us of the strange joy in solving something impossible. Sometimes you do not need a screen. You just need 6 sides and a little bit of patience. The Canoe rental shack by the creek was not a business so much as a suggestion. A crooked sign, 3 boats tied to a tree, and a man named Gary who might have been there since 1948. Dad would slap a 20 into Gary's hand and say, "We'll be back in a couple hours," like it was no big deal. No forms, no helmets, no waiver. Just a paddle, a life vest that definitely had not been certified since Eisenhower, and you, wobbling into a canoe while Dad shoved you off the bank with 1 foot. Once you got going, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud life usually is. Birds overhead, water slapping against the side, and Dad telling the same story about how he once saw a snapping turtle the size of a garbage can. You never saw one, but you wanted to. You learned how to steer, sort of, and how to duck when you went under a low branch too late. You got soaked, you laughed, and when you finally dragged the canoe back onto dry land, Dad would clap you on the shoulder like you had just completed Navy SEAL training. But if that creek showed you the earth, the next place aimed a little higher, right up into the stars. Generic brand groceries were the quiet label of struggle in the 1980s. Walk into any store and you would see those plain white boxes with nothing but bold black lettering, cornflakes, macaroni, or just soup. No mascots, no cartoons, no sparkle. They sat on the bottom shelf like they were trying not to be noticed. But they were. Everyone saw them. Kids knew what they meant. If those showed up in your cart, you were not getting prizes in your cereal. You were just getting food. Some tasted okay. Some tasted like cardboard. But they filled the pantry. And that was the point. They were cheaper by quarters that mattered. Some families would peel off the labels just so the box did not scream. Others embraced them, one no-name can at a time. In school lunches, you hoped no one saw the off-brand cookies. You ate them fast, hoping they passed for the real thing. Generic brand groceries were not glamorous. They were not meant to be. But they were the invisible badge of getting by. And for the families that counted every dollar, those blank white labels were a quiet promise. You were doing what you could, and you were not alone. The Viewmaster was not just a toy, it was a portal. You held it up to your face like binoculars, clicked the lever, and entered a new world, one tiny slide at a time. These were not just pictures. They were 3D windows into places you had never been and shows you loved. Suddenly, Bugs Bunny was popping out at you. You were walking through Disneyland or swimming under the sea. The images were bright, bold, and vivid, especially when the sunlight hit just right. The reels came in paper packets, labeled like treasure maps, each one promising a new adventure, and you kept them all, in shoeboxes, in drawers, maybe scattered across the floor until your mom made you pick them up. The Viewmaster made you feel like a traveler, even if you never left your room. It was quiet entertainment. No batteries, no wires, no screens. Just your imagination and a satisfying click with every slide. The joy was in the anticipation. What will the next picture be? Where will I go next? You could spend hours lost in it. You remember how your arms got tired, but you kept clicking. One more reel. One more journey. Because for those few minutes, the world was just you and the magic inside that plastic viewer. It was not just a fad, it was a movement on wheels. Roller disco took two things already lighting up the 1970s, roller skating and disco music, and blended them into a spinning, neon-fueled fever dream. Skating rinks became sanctuaries, not just for exercise, but for expression. You could glide, twirl, groove under glowing lights with glitter on your cheeks and bell-bottoms flaring behind you. For many, it was the first time movement felt like magic. Roller disco gave you permission to show off, to be loud with your body, to let the music carry you. Couples held hands in choreographed routines. Lone skaters turned figure eights into declarations of identity. The disco ball spun, the speakers thumped, and the floor lit up with people trying to outshine their own reflection. It was rhythmic rebellion against boredom, conformity, and everything beige about suburban life. For kids and teens alike, those weekends at the rink were sacred. You were not skating. You were starring in your own movie. The soundtrack was Donna Summer. The costume was whatever made you feel like gold. And for a few hours, the world outside those rink walls disappeared. It was just a little old lady with a giant bun and a tiny hamburger patty. But in 1984, Clara Peller said 3 words that would shake the advertising world to its core. "Where's the beef?" she shouted, eyes narrowed, voice sharp. And suddenly the entire country could not stop repeating it. Wendy's had hit gold. This was not just a commercial. It was a cultural earthquake. It was parodied on late-night television, referenced in presidential campaigns, and printed on bumper stickers coast to coast. People were not just buying hamburgers. They were buying attitude. The ad turned fast food into theater and customers into critics. It questioned everything: value, honesty, expectations. And it did it in under 30 seconds. For a moment in time, a three-word punchline became the nation's conscience. Then it faded, as all catchphrases do. But the genius of it stuck. We live in an era drowning in marketing, and still, no one ever quite topped Clara's gravelly challenge. The line is funny, sure, but it is also something more. It is a demand, a standard, a dare. In a world of hollow promises, maybe we are all still asking, where is the beef? It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store. Using layaway plans was how your family brought home the things they could not afford all at once. The process was simple but long. You picked something out, paid a little now, and waited. Every week or every paycheck, your parents went back to the store and handed over a few more dollars. The items stayed behind the counter, out of reach, until that last payment clicked everything into place. Maybe it was a winter coat. Maybe it was a bike for Christmas. Sometimes it was furniture or shoes or something that felt big, because it was. You did not get instant gratification. You got slow, hard-earned reward. There was no credit card swipe, no overnight shipping, just weeks of waiting, hoping, and counting. You learned patience. You learned value. And when that final receipt was signed, it felt like winning something impossible. Other families might have walked out with full bags. Yours walked out with pride. Layaway meant you were not giving up. You were building towards something, one payment at a time. And even now, when you buy something in full, you still feel that echo, the deep understanding that waiting made it sweeter. If you remember Clacker toys, you probably also remember getting smacked in the face. These were two solid acrylic balls connected by a string, meant to be swung up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand. That was the whole toy. No batteries, no screen. Just two hard spheres ready to leave a bruise. And kids loved them. The louder and faster they clacked, the cooler you were. It was a skill to master. Get the rhythm right, and you could keep them going for minutes. Get it wrong, and you got a nasty surprise. Parents hated them. Teachers banned them. Hospitals probably kept a few on hand just to demonstrate what not to do. They were loud, dangerous, and oddly satisfying. For a few wild years, clackers were everywhere, on sidewalks, in classrooms, and hidden under beds when they got taken away. Eventually, safety concerns shut them down, but not before a generation got their fill of noise and near misses. They were outlawed in some places, but that only made them cooler. If you ever got them moving just right, you remember the thrill, and maybe a headache to go with it. They were chaos in toy form, and we would not have had it any other way. The leisure suit was the uniform of laid-back ambition. Made of polyester, often in colors so bold they looked radioactive, it was what you wore when you wanted to be taken seriously, but also wanted to boogie. It was business casual before anyone knew what that meant. And in the 1970s, it was everywhere. On dads, on disco dance floors, on daytime television hosts who looked like they had rolled out of a department store window display. The wide lapels, the matching pants and jacket, the shirt just unbuttoned enough to show a little chest hair and maybe a gold medallion. The leisure suit said, "I am here to close the deal, and then I am heading straight to the dance floor." It was confidence stitched into fabric, but it was also accessibility. Anyone could own one. You did not have to be rich. You just had to want to stand out. In an era full of big personalities and bigger statements, the leisure suit was the middle-class man's disco armor. It did not matter if the fabric made you sweat or if the color turned heads for all the wrong reasons. What mattered was that you looked like you had somewhere exciting to be. And maybe, for one shimmering moment, you actually did. August 1st, 1981. The screen turned black, then bright. A rocket launched, and suddenly music was never the same again. Video Killed the Radio star echoed into living rooms across America, and MTV was born. But it did more than play music. It created a new kind of artist. Musicians were no longer just heard. They had to be seen, and not just seen, styled, staged, and sold like visual dreams. Madonna wore lace and crucifixes. Michael Jackson moonwalked into legend. And teenagers sat glued to their televisions like it was the only truth they had. This was the first time music had a face, and it changed everything. We did not just hear songs, we lived them. For a generation raised on radio, this felt like stepping into color for the first time. The music video era made icons out of mortals. It taught us that fashion could talk and that dance could sell a chorus better than a lyric ever could. It was commercial, it was loud, it was brilliant. And for one fleeting electric moment, MTV was more than a channel. It was culture, burning neon and beautiful in the dark. When did we stop watching music with our eyes? You know the place. Wood paneling on every wall, carpet so sticky it felt like your shoes might stay behind without you. The local bowling alley was not fancy. It was not even clean. But it was ours. That neon open sign buzzing in the window like it had not taken a break since 1963, that was the beacon. Dad would hand you a pair of shoes that smelled like defeat and victory all at once, then lace up his own with the confidence of a man who once bowled a turkey in '68. Scoreboards flashed with those pixelated animations, and the jukebox in the corner had a permanent skip in track 6. The cheese fries came in paper boats, scalding hot and gooey enough to glue your soul together. You would keep score with a tiny pencil, and Dad would act like the math was rocket science. For some reason, that made it better. There was always one ball he swore by, the dusty maroon one with a chipped thumb hole that he said gave him more spin. It never did, but he let you try it anyway. And after every frame, win or gutter, he high-fived like it was the championship. But if you really want to see Dad in his element, wait until you hear about the dented can grocery run. Limited extracurricular activities were just another way the world reminded you what you could not afford. Other kids had piano lessons, karate classes, and sports teams with matching uniforms. You had afternoons at home watching TV or playing outside with a stick and a rock. Sign-up fees were too high, equipment cost too much. Even the rides to practice were out of reach if the car was needed for work. You brought home the flyers from school and left them on the table, hoping. Sometimes they just disappeared. Sometimes your parents gently explained that maybe next time meant probably never. You cheered from the sidelines, you watched from the crowd, and you learned how to clap with a smile even when your heart wanted in. It was not fair, it stung, but you found other ways to grow. You read library books, you drew comics in the margins of your notebook, you played tag until the sun went down, and maybe you missed out on trophies and tournaments, but you learned resilience, creativity, and how to find joy in the quiet spaces. You might not have worn the jersey, but you still showed up, and that mattered. They looked strange. Let us get that out of the way. Earth shoes were not designed to win beauty contests. They were designed to change how you moved through the world. With their negative heel technology, yes, that was a real term, the heel sat lower than the toes, promising better posture and a more natural stride. People either loved them or stared at them like a science experiment. But in the 1970s, they were a quiet rebellion against the synthetic, the unnatural, the overly shiny. Earth shoes were about grounding yourself, literally and figuratively. They were part of the Back to Nature movement, the idea that progress might lie in turning back. You were not just buying a shoe, you were buying a philosophy, a footprint that said, "I walk differently. I walk purposefully." They were sold in health food stores, worn by free spirits and those who read ingredient labels before it was cool. Sure, they looked a little like potatoes, but to their fans, they felt like freedom. They were not chasing fashion. They were chasing balance. Before tablets, before streaming, before every show on earth was one click away, there was only one place to be on a Saturday morning. In front of the television, cereal in hand, pajamas still warm from bed. The screen would light up with the thunder of Thundercats, the roar of He-Man, the transforming crash of Autobots. These were not just cartoons. They were our best friends, our imaginary adventures, our emotional security blankets. For 2 golden hours, the world made sense. You cheered, laughed, and learned the kind of values that grown-ups forgot to teach: justice, teamwork, heroism, and most of all, fun. These shows were loud, animated love letters to a generation who needed a break from reality. And when the credits rolled and your mom called you to get dressed, it was like waking up from a dream. The ritual was so sacred, networks competed with one another like gladiators for your sleepy-eyed loyalty. Then, quietly, it all faded. Saturday morning cartoons disappeared, replaced by talk shows and infomercials. Now, we watch on demand, anytime we want. But it is not the same, because we did not just watch those shows, we waited for them. And in the waiting, we found something real. The miniature golf course with homemade obstacles was never part of a chain. It was part of someone's backyard that got out of hand. The fence leaned, the AstroTurf peeled at the corners, and the scorecards were photocopies from sometime around 1967. But to Dad, this was sacred ground. "Watch out for the windmill," he would say, pointing to a lopsided contraption that spun more out of habit than engineering. Hole 6 had a dinosaur, once green, now a sad, grayish blue with a missing eye, and Hole 9 was uphill into what looked like a mailbox from a sci-fi movie. Dad kept score with one of those tiny pencils, sometimes generous, sometimes forgetting that penalty stroke. He cheered every shot like you had just qualified for a Masters tournament, and when he sunk a hole in one, he would raise his hands like he had won a trophy. The best part? Ice cream sandwiches at the end, slightly melted from the cooler behind the counter. You never asked for anything more. But if the ground game was that magical, just wait until you went airborne, watching planes take off from a sleepy little airport that felt like your own private runway. Tie-dye was not just fabric, it was philosophy worn on the body. With its spirals, bursts, and sun-soaked blotches, tie-dye told the world you were untamed, that you did not need order to find beauty. Every shirt was its own universe. No 2 swirls ever matched. And that randomness felt like truth. It started with the counterculture and hippies who spun protest and peace into cotton and dye. But by the 1970s, it had gone mainstream. From backyard birthday parties to beach towns, tie-dye spread like a sunbeam across the country. It was cheap, easy, joyful. A white t-shirt, some rubber bands, and a splash of color was all it took to feel like an artist, to make a statement. It looked like summer, felt like freedom, and hinted at something deeper. That life, like art, was better when it broke the rules. Tie-dye made your closet a canvas and your torso a rebellion. Even decades later, people still wear it. Not because it is trendy, but because it is honest. And that matters more than ever. Masters of the Universe was the first time kids got a full-blown animated saga wrapped around their plastic heroes. It was a marketing masterstroke, a show designed to sell toys that actually made you believe in the characters. Skeletor, Tila, Orko. They were not just sidekicks or enemies. They were your childhood companions. Every after-school episode felt like an adventure. You learned courage, honor, even self-worth, all before dinner. These were not simple toys. They were world builders. Your bedroom floor became Eternia, and your imagination had no limits. But eventually, they made way for flashier franchises, newer tech, and shinier packaging. He-Man was packed up in boxes, left behind with broken swords and dusty armor. But his impact never really faded. For one golden stretch of years, kids were the authors of epic tales, not just the audience. And in those stories, anything felt possible. Why did we stop handing power to the people? The Oddball Roadside Museum was where logic went to take a nap. You saw the hand-painted sign from the highway, "Come see the world's largest pencil," or "America's first toaster still works." Dad would swerve into the gravel lot like it was destiny. Admission was cheap, $3 cash only, and worth every penny. The inside was a fever dream. Display cases filled with bottle caps from all 50 states. A whole wall dedicated to vintage shampoo bottles. A two-headed taxidermy calf that haunted your dreams for a week. "You brought the kid today, huh?" he would say, as if Dad came here weekly. You followed them through rooms of strange collections while Dad laughed and read every single placard out loud. It was like watching a kid in a candy store, only the candy was lawn darts, Pez dispensers, and World War II ration kits. "Now this," Dad would say, holding up a glass jar with something floating in it. "This is history." And even though you rolled your eyes, part of you agreed. But if you really want to feel history in motion, just wait until you join him by the old train tracks, watching boxcars roll by, counting like your life depended on it. Weebles were not just toys. They were little lessons in resilience. Egg-shaped and bottom-heavy, they never stayed down. You could knock them over, slam them around, or roll them across the floor, but they always popped back upright. Their slogan said it best, "Weebles wobble, but they do not fall down." And as silly as that sounded, it meant something. For kids living through inflation, energy crises, and a world changing faster than adults could explain, there was comfort in a toy that refused to give up. Weebles came in families, playsets, little plastic houses, and cars. You could build entire towns around them. They were cheerful, simple, and weirdly unbreakable. They did not just bounce back. They taught you that you could too. In a world full of falls, Weebles offered a silent promise. You will rise again. Every time they popped back up, it was like they were saying, "Try again." They taught persistence in the most innocent way possible. No lectures, no lessons, just a toy that could take a hit and keep smiling. They lived on windowsills, toy chests, and car dashboards. And even if you outgrew them, their message lingered. Life knocks you around. You wobble, but you do not fall down. Weebles did not just entertain, they reassured. And in a decade that often felt like one long series of challenges, that reassurance was priceless. There was a time when walking into a room with big hair and broader shoulders was not a joke. It was a power move. The 1980s did not whisper, it roared. And nothing roared louder than a head of teased-up hair and a blazer that could poke someone's eye out. Volume was not just for radios. It was for your whole look. Women padded their suits to match men in the boardroom. Men sprayed their hair like rock gods and strutted down sidewalks like runways. Every silhouette was a billboard. I am here. You will notice. It was the decade of excess, and style reflected that hunger. Hair reached for the ceiling, shoulder pads touched the clouds, and for a brief moment, confidence had a uniform. It was not about subtlety. It was about stature. You looked big to feel big, and in a strange way, it worked. But trends fade, and now those old photos look like caricatures. But underneath the neon and aquanet, something real was happening. People were learning how to be loud without saying a word. We laugh now, but maybe what we lost was the bravery of standing tall, even if it meant stuffing your sleeves to get there. The local train tracks were not on any map of attractions, but they might as well have been your Saturday headquarters. Dad would pull up to that familiar patch of gravel beside the crossing, engine off, thermos in hand. Steam curled from the lid as he poured black coffee like he was settling in for a movie. You sat on the hood, knees pulled up, eyes scanning the horizon. Then, clack, 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 the first rumbles came. A distant whistle echoed across the fields, and the train rolled in, all muscle and thunder. Dad would nod like he timed it himself, and the counting began. 1, 2, 3. Boxcar after boxcar, faded logos, rust streaks, some tagged with graffiti from cities you had never seen. Sometimes you brought a notebook, sometimes just your eyes, but you always left with the same question. Where were they all going? Dad would lean back against the car, sip his coffee, and tell you a story that may or may not have been true. It did not matter. What mattered was the rhythm, the waiting, the wonder. And if you were lucky, the next stop was just as legendary. A miniature golf course where no obstacle was regulation, and every putt told a story. So before you head out, share in the comments which 1970s relic you miss or are glad is gone. Tap like if this trip back in time made you smile, and subscribe so you never miss more forgotten pieces of everyday life.